Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the forgeman he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
عاشبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد عاشبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد راجل واحد مبدأ واحد
عاش في ثورتنا
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية
وسمعنا
أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجندي العربي عاش.
عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش فلاح الصبر عاش.
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروي حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروي حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الفن رسالة عاش.
عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار، فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار، فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايد صدرناه. حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايد صدرناه. قولوا معايا حيوا معايا
عاش عاش العامل عاش.
عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجيل الصاعد عاش.
عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ردينا عليك يا جمال وايدينا في ايديك يا جمال، وطلعنا معاك يا جمال نبني وياك يا جمال. ردينا عليك
يا جمال
وايدينا في ايديك
يا جمال،
وطلعنا معاك
يا جمال
نبني وياك يا جمال. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش عبد الناصر عاش.
Утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжается бой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.
И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 3rd of February, 2024, and we find ourselves in momentous territory once again with regard to witnessing the decline and fall of the American empire. So, we are taking a little bit of a different route tonight, though, as we talked extensively about that yesterday evening. And the topic of tonight is, of course, the Madness of Malthus, which will be a look at the foundations of Malthusianism, which will be the topic of the discussion, as I said, and it'll be the main topic tonight, though, of course, we will find time for questions, comments. Feel free to throw in any particular concerns that you want. It is a free-for-all in the chat with even the presence of fascists can inspire creativity, as we discovered last night. And for those of you who don't know, this is the now the regular time for this program. It will be the regular time going forward. And I'm going to aim to have this on every night in terms of the live show, and the Patreon shows will take place probably every Sunday as an extra as well. So thank you to everybody who's tuned in so far. I'm just going to do the appropriate advertising in the various different places. And if you want to queue up your questions in the chat, feel free to do so. I'm also just going to talk a little bit while I'm doing this about the recent, most recent, I should say, ICJ verdict, which you may have seen being tweeted about by a frequent guest on the show, Kit Clarenberg, which seems to have, I haven't read the full verdict yet, I must admit. I've just read the commentary on it and the article that Kit linked to, which seems to have basically found that the Ukrainian accusations of genocide made against the Russian Federation have, well, these have been roundly rejected by the ICJ. Now, I will, of course, mention to you ad nauseum that this is, of course, something that isn't particularly valuable in terms of actual material reality, but it does tell us something in terms of the even like a court which is largely regarded as being controlled by the imperialist powers is rejecting many of the accusations made by the West. And remember, the Ukrainian state had a big legal team, big, very highly paid legal team, supplied by Western law firms, particularly Britain and the United States. So this is a big defeat, and one that it is worth paying some attention to. So, who do we have here so far? I have found a way of adjusting the levels of the microphone, though I am still going to get a new one because this old thing I've had around for about must be 3 years now, so it's probably time to invest in something new. But hello to so far. Comrade, hello, hi, hello to you. Oz, good evening to you. Ash, good morning from the other end of the world down in Melbourne. Good to have you with us. Moonis, hello. And Muzzle Paint, who says solidarity, comrades. Alder Larkin, who says good evening from Dublin and respect for all your good work. Thank you very much. And good evening to Rianne out there in Wales. Hope the weather's as miserable and cold for you as it is for us, which it frequently is, of course. C. Bolt says, evening comrades from a man who stood on miners' picket line in his school lunch hour. Well, salute to you, sir. What's this song, asks Oz. I don't know. I'll have to put a track listing on. Lenin is young again. I think the comrade below has just announced that. The audio has been fixed on any Sundry Mule, to answer your concern, but still going for the new mic. Greetings to Rob and greetings to Beans, who are both tuning in from the wrong side of the Pennines, but we don't hold that against anybody here. Regionalism is the death of movements. And Roddy, good evening to you. J. Londonono, greetings and evening from Chorlton. Is that Chorlton, Manchester? Because in that case, you're about a stone's throw away from me. Comrade Hello Hi says, as I was saying yesterday, the right is backed by capitalism and rejected by working people, which increased the anti-fascist movement in the mid-2010s. Right, okay, yes, this is the thing I needed to pick up on. Right, put a pin in that, we'll come back to it later. Muzzle Paint, glad you're enjoying the programs. Good evening to Otis, and hello to our friend Dan Kovalik. Good evening to you, or is it afternoon where you are on the east coast of the United States? Yuan, hello to you. Rian says it's Wales, of course. The weather is shite, and for those of you who are on the other side of the Atlantic, shite is a very, very British piece of terminology. It means shit. AJ Williamson, good evening. Yes, you can always ask questions in the chat. Or put them in there, but also bear in mind I'm going to go through the material I've prepared on Malthus first. So if you want your question paid attention to later, be sure to remind me that you put it in earlier in the chat, or just copy and paste it in later, and I will come back to it. So we will now proceed onwards with the business at hand, and I wanted to look at Thomas Robert Malthus and Marx's critique of him today, because I wanted to make a broader point about the fact that there is nothing new when it comes to tendencies within the ruling class. Now, a lot of people over the last 4 years or so, since, of course, the year of COVID and everything that's spilt out from that, and there are people who've noticed this beforehand, but I think it's been noticed en masse, particularly by people who've been attracted to what you might call the reactionary petty bourgeois populism in the United States and Europe, with regard to places like the World Economic Forum and the various different think tanks of American imperialism, where the capitalist class, which is largely but not exclusively based in the United States and Western Europe, goes to have its discussions and its conspiracies. Excuse me. And people have been rightly noticing that how many of these people, how many of the members of the capitalist class are obsessed with things like control of birth rates, control of population, control of the diet of the working class, making sure that the diet of the working class can be as cheaply produced as possible and mass-produced ideally, and can be delivered in as rapid a fashion as possible. Of course, this is just standard capitalist practice. But also that the capitalist class themselves seem to have a psychotic, or at least, shall we say, schizophrenic attitude towards the existence of the working class, in that they seek to drill them, diet them, treat them like cattle, to use a phrase that was, of course, in the final speech of Charlie Chaplin's Great Dictator. And people, of course, react to this by saying, well, you know, when they see the rather stupid ideas coming out from these various sort of these lunatic characters in the World Economic Forum and other places, like I won't eat the bugs, or I won't eat your synthetic steak, etc., etc. And also people then start to think that, well, maybe there's some sort of plan to wipe out large numbers of the population. Maybe they're using bioweapons on us. Maybe the vaccine's designed to cause everybody's heart to stop and everyone to keel over and die. I've seen all of this said to varying degrees. Now, what I wanted to do was to start looking at where all this came from, or the thinking of the capitalist class on these questions comes from, to clarify what it means. Because if you don't clarify what it means, then you end up running around in circles listening to either Alex Jones or Russell fucking Brand, who, though I will defend his right to be regarded as innocent until proven guilty of various charges that have been made against him, and he's right not to be go through trial by media, I find him a tedious waste of time. So, with that aside, let's move on. So, what I'm going to be doing is looking at Malthus, because Malthus represents a number of things, and Malthusianism, which comes from, obviously from his work, is a very powerful trend and mode of thought within the ruling class, within the capitalist class. And it has been, of course, since the days of Malthus himself. He wrote two very famous or infamous, depending upon your point of view, essays on population. And these came to be embraced by the British capitalist class and later by the American capitalist class. And they came to merge with other trends in with the bourgeois intelligentsia of the 19th and early 20th centuries, such as social Darwinism, which I'll come to explain more about later, and also some what can only be described as like some distinctly fascist forms of so-called ecological thought. And these were very popular amongst the British and American ruling classes in the early part of the 20th century, right through the period of the early to middle Cold War as well. And this, of course, was used, as I'll go on to explain, by the ruling class to dress up their imperialist actions in places like Africa in green clothing. And this was during what is referred to as the Green Revolution, which, of course, took place in the 60s and 70s. So control over the food supply, using ecological arguments to gain control over fertile land, using environmentalist arguments to justify control of population figures. None of this is new. This has all been there from the very beginning. So where does it come from? It starts, of course, and here we must again go back to first principles and origins. It starts with the very dawn of capitalism itself, and a tendency that, of course, is there, which is that as soon as the capitalist class triumphs in the struggle for power with the absolutism of, say, in England's case, Charles I, or in the American case with regard to freeing the 13 original states from the grip of the English crown, to in the case of the French Revolution, into freeing themselves from Bourbon absolutism. As soon as this is done, of course, the fact that, as Marx observed, the capitalist class has at the same time created its own gravediggers in the form of the proletariat becomes immediately obvious. I've mentioned many times before about how the Putney debates at the end of the First English Civil War, which reveal the full nature of the contradictions of the Enlightenment period, where the bourgeoisie makes appeals to universal values, universal rights, in order to mobilize the early proletariat and peasantry against the absolute monarchs. But then, of course, immediately pulls up the drawbridge in a quite literal sense and says to those they have mobilized, well, you get the right to live under our rule, we being the property owners, we being the true representatives of the nation. And isn't it good that you get to live under our rule rather than under the tyranny of the king? Because, of course, we are bound by laws. They're not, of course, but they like to say that they are. And this, of course, manifests itself in much more clearly dramatic ways when you get things like the limitations of the French Revolution being revealed, which is that the masses in the French Revolution, the very early form of the proletariat, the journeymen of Paris, the impoverished masses of Paris, and of course in the countryside, the peasantry, power the revolution via their allegiance with the Jacobins forward relentlessly. But of course they can't fully realize a proletarian dictatorship at that time because the proletariat barely exists in France at that particular moment, where the means of production aren't developed enough to have brought the mass industrial proletariat into existence. So what you see, though, in the reaction of the English ruling class to the rise of the proletariat, or the early versions of the proletariat in the 17th and the 18th centuries, is the horrible realization on the part of the bourgeoisie that, oh my God, we have created here a seething mass of humanity which will surely destroy us. And their fear of the proletariat is what plays a very large role in curtailing all the subsequent bourgeois revolutions, from the feebleness of the German bourgeoisie in 1848 to the truncated nature of Italian unification in the 1870s, to the feebleness of the Russian bourgeois against the Tsardom, constantly looking to follow its Prussian and German brethren and cut a deal with the remnants of feudalism, rather than rely on a radicalized and mobilized proletariat to chase away the remnants of feudalism. They prefer to cut a deal with it and accommodate its interests and make it and come to some sort of unified point, which was very much how they saw the English Revolution as having gone, though that was, of course, because it was the first one, there was a lot of trial and error. And in the writings of people like Edmund Burke, going all the way back to the French Revolution, you can see in his book, the reflections on the revolution in France, the real naked horror of the ruling class of Britain at the time, in what he's regarding. And what he's most horrified about is the mobilization of what you might call the plebeian masses in Paris. Is the fact that they, of course, dragged the king off his throne and executed him, even though, of course, Edmund Burke conveniently forgot that this was how the wonderful state of affairs that he enjoyed in Britain had come into existence. It wouldn't have come into existence without the beheading of a king, though all the English writers like to forget that. But again, he's horrified principally not by the overthrow of autocracy. He's not in favour of the remaining in power of absolutism, but he's horrified by the mobilization of the masses that, of course, destroys the Bourbon monarchy and introduces the first, well, truly revolutionary dictatorship. The Cromwellian dictatorship was revolutionary in its own way, but the Jacobin dictatorship and the revolutionary terror was something that was simply on a much bigger scale and much more dramatic than anything that Cromwell had done. And this, of course, horrifies people like Burke. And you can see in his work, he's confronting, intellectually speaking, the growing realization that they have basically created a system which is, at best, for them, transitory. And this is, of course, what Marxists say about capitalism, and it's borne out, I think, by the very response of the bourgeois thinkers to the development of the system in the 18th and into the 19th century, which is that they're, on the one hand, they welcome it, but they're also immediately disgusted by it. They immediately see the dangers in it. They're immediately repulsed by the sight of this mass urbanization of the masses of the proletariat coming together. Even though of course, their class is profiting from it, they're also horrified by it because they know, the more intelligent of them know, that this is a dire threat to them and will ultimately be their gravediggers, which is why, of course, this adds strength to our argument that the capitalism has its end baked into its very beginning. And it's why, of course, you get in Britain, that is, of course, the oldest continually existing capitalist nation. The Venetian Republic, I would argue, was the first, though it didn't last as long as Britain has. It's why in Britain many bourgeois political scientists have tried to come up with all kinds of theories as to why Britain's deindustrialized. It's because of imperialism, of course, and the declining rate of profit that leads to imperialism. But one of the things they come up with, and in order to try and explain it, and this was, I was reading one of my old undergraduate textbooks the other day that supplied us with these theories from these political scientists as to why Britain deindustrialized. And one of the theories was that the British ruling class, because of the survival of the aristocracy, had been desperate for admittance to the aristocracy as a way of securing social capital for themselves. And also because of the survival of the aristocracy as the intellectual wing of the ruling class, the respectability that came from land ownership was what all of the ruling class craved, and that they wanted to get out of the business of manufacturing because it was dirty and disgusting and horrible. Now, that's, of course, a cartoonish explanation if you rely on that for your entire explanation. What they've done with these theories is that they've isolated tiny fragments of the truth and they've presented them as a whole theory. So the idea that the British ruling class wants to retreat to a simple and bucolic agricultural life, there is, of course, a grain of truth in that. In that if you actually speak to any of these people, I went to university with lots of the offspring of the ruling class, so trust me, I know what I'm talking about to a degree. They all aspire to, of course, the country estate miles away from the seething, dark and satanic hellholes of the city. And this is something which is a trend within the ruling class, but it doesn't come from the fact that they just love the countryside. It's deep-rooted within the ruling class that they are horrified by their own creations. One could, at a stretch, of course, take this in a literary direction and start reflecting upon the work of Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, being that Dr. Frankenstein perhaps could be taken as representing an early capitalist, and the monster that he has put together could represent a sort of nightmarish vision that a capitalist has of his creation of the proletariat, perhaps, that will, of course, relentlessly pursue him and ultimately destroy him. That's one interpretation you could give. So the work of people like Malthus needs to be seen in this light. In the intellectual climate of the late 18th century, when he wrote his first essay on population, he is reflecting, of course, the fears of the bourgeoisie at the time. And it's the bourgeoisie he's writing for, principally, of course. He's not writing for the working class, because as we'll see, he absolutely despises the working class. And so Malthus's first essay, and I think it's important to distinguish what he was and what he wasn't arguing for. Malthus, in his first original essay of 1798, wrote that there was a constant pressure of population on the food supply, and that this had been there from the very beginning of human existence, and that this was something which he didn't put in the first essay, that there will be a problem with overpopulation. He just said that there would be constant pressure on the food supply. And Engels, of course, wrote that, well, if you think that there's been constant pressure on the food supply due to the existence of human beings, then you'll believe that there was pressure there as soon as the first human evolved into existence. So his argument there wasn't that there was overpopulation. He went on to develop that argument later on. He was reflecting a common belief at the time, which was that that urbanization and the vast growth of the cities and rapid growth of the cities that was taking hold was going to lead to unbearable and intolerable pressure on the ability of the system to produce food. It was a very common belief within the ruling class at the time. Of course, they couldn't stop urbanization. They needed urbanization. They needed to grow the proletariat. But of course, this reflects their fears and their reluctance over what they have created. So again, it comes out of that. And again, like Marx and Engels relentlessly mock him. So here, though, I'm going to be focusing mainly on the fact that the facts regarding Malthus's sort of social and political views, and how this developed through into social Darwinism and other trends in bourgeois thought. Malthus's work on political economy is something quite different. Well, not quite different. It needs its own treatment. This is why I'm getting hold of Marx's, what's called Capital Volume 4, Theories of Surplus Value, where there's a very extensive critique of Malthus's views on political economy there. So I'm going to do that as a separate episode. But the thing to bear in mind at this stage is that Malthus is a sort of dystopian figure, whereas people like William Godwin, who was a writer at the same time, who was, of course, Mary Shelley's father, was one of the great English utopians of this period. You have William Godwin, you have people like Thomas Paine, who represent the extreme end, in a good way, of the bourgeois radicalism at the time. Godwin is a plain, good old-fashioned English utopian. in that Godwin didn't believe that there was the need for, that there was this, that the system was heading for crisis. He didn't believe that humanity was heading for crisis. He believed in he was a sort of utopian communist. He took Enlightenment theories to their absolute endpoint, which is that he, of course, wanted all these theories to genuinely apply in a universal sense, which is what animated his work, which is his main work, which is the Inquiry Concerning Political Justice. So Godwin was something of a sort of counterpoint to Malthus in that, unlike Malthus, Godwin believed in practicing contraception. He was very radical on that belief. He believed in the full equality of women. Of course, his wife was Mary Wollstonecraft, a great writer herself. And he believed that there would be a future where the human race would regulate itself by living in harmony with nature, and that an equilibrium would be reached. Malthus didn't think that, of course. First of all, Malthus believed, as a clergyman, which he was, that contraception was a sin. So there's already contradictions mounting up in Malthus's thinking. On the one hand, he thinks that any population growth results in intolerable pressure on the food supply. On the other hand, he believes that there should be no contraception whatsoever. He later amends this in his second essay, published after 1806, when he says that, well, maybe there'll need to be some self-restraint within marriage. That's as much as he's prepared to give. The Catholic rhythm method, if you will, even though, of course, he was a Protestant. So the way in which Malthus develops his theories starts to go more and more in direction that we might be familiar with, which is that he starts to argue more and more that the problem is that the population in England especially is growing too quickly, and he becomes more and more openly hostile towards the growth of the proletariat. And this is much more noticeable in his second essay. In the first essay, he's comparatively restrained. In the second essay, let's just read you a quote so you can hear what he actually believed in. By 1806, he's become much more rabid in his beliefs. He is now convinced that the country is becoming overburdened with too many, and this is going to sound familiar, scroungers, I think that would be the modern term. And so he began to agitate forcefully for a redrawing of the poor laws to basically make the workhouse and anybody who was seeking poor relief from the local authorities in the local borough or parish, basically subject to such a regime of terror and humiliation that they would flee to factory life. And this is something which not just Malthus wrote about, but people in the later 18th century were writing about. Marx chronicles this in the later chapters of Capital, where he talks about the way that the bourgeois in the later 18th century in Britain sought to push more and more people into factory life by, first of all, driving them off the land, and second of all, by making those who were forced to resort to the charity given out by the local authorities, subjecting them to such a level of punishment and humiliation that factory life and 12, 14, 16-hour days and barely a day off looked like a jolly day out in comparison. So Malthus, being a good moral Christian parson, fulminated in his second essay particularly about children who were born out of wedlock. This particularly concerned him. So here's a delightful quote from his second essay. It goes as follows. A man who is born into a world already possessed, if he cannot get subsistence from his parents on whom he has a just demand, and if the society do not want his labour, has no claim of right to the smallest portion of food, and in fact has no business to be where he is. At nature's mighty feast there is no vacant cover for him. She tells him to be gone, and will quickly execute her own orders if he do not work on the compassion of some of her guests. If these guests get up and make room for him, other intruders immediately appear, demanding the same favour. The order and harmony of the feast is disturbed. The plenty that before reigned is changed into scarcity. The guests learn too late their error in counteracting those strict orders to all intruders, issued by the great mistress of the feast, who, wishing that all her guests should have plenty, and knowing that she could not provide for unlimited numbers, humanely refused to admit fresh comers when her table was already full. Now, that's a particularly fun passage, isn't it? And you can see why Malthus is a despised and spat upon figure, which he deserves to be. But again, he's reflecting a very common view at the time. Now, let's just go over this. What is the feast of which he talks there? The feast is, of course, that which is provided for the ruling class. It's what is provided to the ruling class and the sort of upper end of the petty bourgeoisie. And Malthus is saying there, of course, that there are limited resources that need to be reserved for those who have truly earned proper access to nature's bounty, and that nature will punish those who are enjoying the feast if they allow in, and out of a misguided sense of moral responsibility, those who are seeking to intrude upon their feast and to stake claim to it, meaning, of course, principally the proletariat. That's who he's referring to. And again, it's a very common view at the time, and it feeds into what Marx denounces in Value, Price and Profit and Wage, Labour and Capital in other works, which is the wages fund doctrine, which in short, refers to the fact that, well, supposed facts as presented by the advocates for this, which included people who'd been in the Chartist movement, by the way. The Malthusian doctrine of scarce resources and scarce capital was actually embraced by even working class leaders at the time. So it's the poison that Malthus poured out into the intellectual climate went everywhere, even into the working class itself. Now, the wages fund, which was frequently stated by factory owners in the middle of the 19th century, stated that any claim made by the proletariat upon wages, upon wanting to see an advance in the amount of wages, a raise in the level of wages, would only lead to bad results. Because what it would do was that it would take resources away, scarce resources away from the capitalist, and therefore the capitalist would then be forced, because funds are so limited, to raise the price of necessities, and therefore any wage rise that the workers won would be immediately cancelled out by a catastrophic raise in the level of prices, in order that the capitalist could restore equilibrium again. That's a rather shortcut version of what Marx is, the argument that he's outlined and Marx argues against in Value, Price and Profit. But this was disputed by Marx, of course, who made the point forcefully in Value, Price and Profit that there had been multiple occasions when Labour had made claim to a wage rise, and that this had been acceded to, but in actual fact that the capitalist class had made up their profit in other ways, such as by increasing the productivity of industry, increasing the productivity of the machinery, investing in new means of production in order to restore profits that way. So it's not that there is this limited pool of funds that are balanced between the labourer and the capitalist. It's that the claims of the working class are going to impinge upon the profits of the capitalist class. But that does not mean that there is this limited source, this limited amount of funds, or in the case of Malthus referring to Mother Nature, this limited source of nature's bounty. What it means is, and what Malthus is actually reflecting in that passage I've just read out, is exactly what Marx is talking about when he's talking about how the capitalist class jealously guards its profits and claims that you can't possibly have any claim upon my profits, because that would mean disaster for society. And in Malthus's political economy, he also represents this point of view. But of course, human beings are not like animals or other members of the animal kingdom, even though there is an argument to say that many animals actually shape their environment and shape their hunting grounds in the hunter-gatherer sense. But unlike animals, we are not merely at the mercy of the seasons anymore, or unlike early man. In fact, as soon as man begins to develop, as soon as the human race becomes a human race, we are constantly innovating ways upon which to improve the productivity of agriculture. For instance, the ability to create new and tougher variants of cereal crops that can grow in a variety of conditions, in harsher conditions. This has been something which has been pioneered in terms of blending seeds together and cultivating new ways of growing more durable crops. This has been going on for many, many thousands of years. Human beings are very innovative creatures. So Malthus's argument only works if you assume that we are in a sort of fixed point, that we can't innovate new methods of production on the land, that we can't find ways of increasing the amount of food that can be produced. And it's been proven wrong comprehensively over and over and over again. The productivity that capitalism has released in terms of its ability to exploit the land and create resources and create the necessities of life is phenomenal. So then you may ask, and there's still people who put forward this idea of, that was pioneered by Malthus, that there's just too many people and that there's too many claims on the limited resources of the earth. It's not that we have too many people. It is, of course, that we actually have a crisis of overproduction constantly. Everybody's familiar in Britain, of course, with the old jokes in series like Yes Minister back in the 80s, or the old tabloid scare stories of the 90s and 2000s about butter mountains and wine lakes and other vast stockpiles of food being produced and then destroyed or left to rot because, of course, it can't be sold. And this isn't a problem of scarce resources. This is a problem that capitalism cannot possibly use the tremendous productivity that its technological innovations actually unlock. That's the problem. And of course, Malthus wasn't prepared to concede that, hence Marx and Engels ripping him apart over and over again. So this is the essence of Malthus's argument, is that there are scarce resources, and any attempt by the workers to claim more of these will inevitably lead to disaster. Nature itself will rebel. So it's just pure bourgeois ideology and fear and hatred and loathing for the working class that pours off every page of Malthus's essays on population. And this has been comprehensively destroyed by capitalism itself. His argument had been destroyed by the fact that British capitalism kept actually innovating and making the land that was farmed in this country more and more productive as time went on. Now, so you might ask, given that capitalism itself kept proving Malthus wrong by even the 1860s, why his theory is still so popular? Well, it comes back to the ideological question with regard to the bourgeoisie. They still have the same fear now that they had when Malthus was writing. They look at the vast numbers of people, even though, of course, the vast numbers of the proletariat that exist out there are necessary for the profits of capital. They still are gripped by the same fear when they look at them. When they see the huge numbers, they just are horrified and think, my God, why can't we retreat to a world where there's half the number of them that there is now? But of course they can't. They need the labor, so they're stuck. This is wherever the capitalist goes, he comes face to face with insoluble contradictions that cannot be resolved under the system. So, of course, he has to resort to magical thinking to try and find an explanation for himself, which is why Malthus sticks around, but not in his original form. He's, as writers like John Bellamy Foster of Monthly Review have chronicled, there's a now mixing of Malthus in with what's called social Darwinism. Now, Darwin himself was actually influenced in his early writings by Malthus's essays on population. But of course, as Marx and Engels point out, Engels in particular, he ends up proving Malthus wrong in The Origin of the Species, no matter what his intentions might have been. So Darwin represents this breaking point, because when you look at Darwin's theories of natural selection, these are, of course, incredibly dangerous for those in the bourgeois who wish to portray the way in which society is structured as an organic and natural order that has been, well, depending upon your religious disposition, ordained by God himself, or that if you want to go down more the secular route, that they are where they are, the ruling class, because sheer hard work and gumption. That's more perhaps of a Northern American Protestant point of view. But certainly there were still many who wished to claim that this was an organic production of a ruling group that had been, if not put there by divine providence, then certainly maybe there was an invisible hand, if you will, guiding them to where they are. And so with the publication of The Origin of the Species, of course, all this gets thrown into doubt, because if human beings evolved out of being ultimately primates, then that rather casts into doubt the whole existence of God. And of course, if there's no God, then there's no divinely inspired order, there's no invisible hand guiding everybody, then my God, we might not deserve to be where we are. So it's a big blow, but of course capitalism innovates, sometimes in a positive sense, often in a negative sense, and intellectually it innovates in a negative sense, and it comes up with a distorted Hall of Mirrors version of Darwin's theory wrapped around Malthus's theories. And this is, of course, social Darwinism, pioneered by people like Herbert Spencer, the man who is still credited as being a great influence on modern anarchism, by the way. And if you don't believe me, go and read Peter Marshall's History of Anarchism. There's a whole chapter in there dedicated to Spencer's influence on anarchism. So Spencer and others adopt a view of Darwin's work which is kind of influenced by the likes of the man described as Darwin's bulldog, T.H. Huxley. But they wrap it around this sort of extreme Victorian English class view, which is that not only are the ruling class exactly where they deserve to be, but also that this is justified by science. Science, bro. Trust the science. And that they came up with, of course, as imperialism was created, all kinds of racialist theories. But they made arguments at certain points that the Irish were a different kind of species, and therefore what was done to them during the famine era was justified. They, of course, made arguments through the racial hierarchy theories that they came up with, that the African was uncivilized and was in fact a different form of human, or a lower form of human, or perhaps not human at all, and therefore could justifiably be either enslaved or mercilessly oppressed. And then they came up with all these theories regarding the hierarchy of the races, race science, so to speak. And this was a very big thing in the later 19th and early 20th centuries. And you combine it with Malthus's views on scarcity of resources, on the fears of the ruling classes of not overpopulation as such, but of the proletariat growing too fast for their resources to catch up with. And therefore the proletariat would, as Malthus reflected in that previous quote, lay claim upon nature's bounties, by which he really meant the profits of the bourgeois, I think. And you combine this together and you get a doctrine which is influenced by sort of an extreme class hatred of the proletariat, combined with this pseudoscience of racialism aimed at, of course, the colonized peoples. And you get a unique combination which is both animated by fear and hatred of the working class, and fear and hatred of them growing too fast and there being too many of them, whilst also justifying the colonial adventures and exploitation of the imperialist powers on the grounds that, well, we're conquering inferior peoples, and therefore these people need to be taken over and their lives need to be regimented and controlled, and their breeding habits need to be controlled by the imperial power. look back at like what the colonial administrators used to say about the way that the colonized peoples bred and the way they needed to be strictly controlled, even after they'd long since been conquered. This is all coming from an unholy and toxic combination of Malthus and social Darwinism. And I read an interesting essay in preparation for this by John Bellamy Foster, where he talked about social Darwinism in the American context, or what he refers to as neo-Malthusianism. And he makes some interesting points in that about how the various American capitalists, including, of course, people like John D. Rockefeller, were very attracted towards this doctrine and remained attracted towards it even into the later 1940s, when, of course, Malthusianism and social Darwinism had gone out of fashion. At least you couldn't say it openly because of their association with, of course, old Adolf himself, the failed Austrian watercolor artist, who'd been a big fan of all of these doctrines, by the way, and especially the idea that, especially the idea of scientific racism, or I should say pseudo-scientific racism. But these doctrines survive because they reflect a very real fear on behalf of the bourgeoisie. And Foster chronicles in his essay on the subject that there is, of course, various people in the American ruling class who continue to make the case, both against the welfare state provisions of the New Deal, and then later, in green terms, against the ability of the newly independent nations to control their own food supply. They used Malthusian arguments to say that these people don't know what they're doing. They need to be guided by people who know how to carry out proper development, which of course was one of the doctrines of the World Bank under the management of Robert McNamara, former Secretary of State for Defense during some of the worst crimes of the Vietnam War. A man who, of course, scientifically worked out how to kill as many people as possible, starting in, of course, the bombing of the Japanese cities at the end of World War II, and then he took those lessons and applied them to the bombing of Vietnam. He later, as president of the World Bank, is credited, even by his enemies, as overseeing great development projects. But what Foster alleges in his essay was that this was all guided by a Malthusian-influenced so-called Green Revolution in the 1960s and 70s, whereby they used like Malthusian arguments to justify the new enclosures of the land of the formerly colonized nations by multinational corporations, basically saying, well, these uncivilized people will just ruin the land if they're allowed to farm it themselves. Best that we develop it, and by develop it they mean turn it over to a corporation for exploitation. So what the likes of Bill Gates argues when he puts on his green hat, and what the likes of the various different characters around the various different think tanks argue these days about the need to about why they're buying up land and why methane from cattle needs to be restricted. A lot of it, of course, is at root. It's all motivated by finding ideological justifications for what? Monopolization, which is what McNamara was doing in his tenure at the World Bank in the 1970s, after he'd left the Defense Department. So Malthus and Malthusianism and neo-Malthusianism is something which is continually useful to the ruling class, which is why it keeps coming back over and over and over again. It is linked to, of course, various forms of fascism, because, of course, fascism has always had an ecological side to it. It's fascism, being the most extreme version of bourgeois reaction, has always had within it this tendency, this fundamental need to, I'm going to go back to my favorite quote from Mandarin Mellon, liquidate capital, liquidate labor, liquidate everything. And what it needs to do with, in order to restore profitability, is to liquidate an awful lot of capital and an awful lot of labor. And its ecological theories, and of course Hitler was a big green guy, are influenced by this need to liquidate capital and labor. And it's also reflecting this sort of extreme fascist ecological thought. It's also reflecting, of course, the most irrational and mad and wild end of bourgeois theories regarding the need for them to return to the land. It's the most extreme end of bourgeois irrationalism is the wish to undo the development of capitalism itself. It's the wish to go back to a period where there were unchallenged lords and masters. Of course, that period's a myth. There was no such thing as a period where the masters were unchallenged. There were constant peasant revolts and wars against the landowners in every single form of society that's ever existed. So this is, of course, mythology, but the bourgeoisie, being a class that is, of course, doomed from its very outset, creating its own gravediggers, when it's confronted with the limitations of its system, collapses into irrationalism, violent irrationalism, and is prone to bouts of extreme melancholy, shall we say. It's prone to bouts of wild, irrational beliefs. It's why you get all these bourgeois types buying like emergency getaways in New Zealand and preparing for the apocalypse, because capitalism in the West, in the United States and Britain and in Western Europe, is log jammed. It's heading towards a greater and greater crisis. And some of the bourgeoisie who have got a bit of awareness of this know that it's coming, but they can more easily visualize the end of the world than they can visualize an alternative. And so that's why, of course, they're doing all this doom mongering and prepping for the apocalypse, because they have no idea how to get themselves out of this situation. So we get like the return of the theories of Malthus, etc. Now, Marxism, and starting with Marx and Engels themselves, of course, reflects that the way in which population grows and the way in which population alters itself, it's also reflective of the abilities of the means of production to sustain life. So, like, as Marx observes himself, the limitations on the ability of the ancient Athenian economy to provide for a population are bear no comparison with the tremendous productive forces that have been created due to, of course, the labor of the proletariat and the innovations that capitalism has wrought. And capitalism, of course, remains unable to fully exploit these. Just look at the log jams in agriculture today, and you can see the problem, that there is this tremendous productive potential right there, that if it was utilized via a planned economy and with the profit motive gone, with the motive being production for the basis of human need. And you look at the tremendous potential that capitalism creates but can't use in the form of the bringing together and the educating of the proletariat, and you think of what could human beings achieve under a globally planned economy, and you can see the future. And it is not the future, the dim and dark future and the twisted future that haunted Malthus's imagination. A socialist system all the way across the world, freed from the constraints of profit and freed from the wild irrationality that capitalism is prone to, and that the capitalist classes themselves are, of course, prone to, could do an enormous piece of development. We could develop towards a situation where, of course, there is very little limit on what we can develop in economic terms, and also what we can do in human terms, where we are already at the point where we produce so much food, we have a crisis of overproduction in it. So there wouldn't be the horrors of overpopulation that Malthus painted. What we'd have is a situation where, because human beings are able to live more rational lives, we'd, of course, at least be at replacement rates in terms of the birth rates question, because, of course, people would actually have a secure existence. They would want to have more children. And, of course, the means of production would be innovating and would further innovate, freed of the profit constraint, to keep up with the population growth. But also that the population tends to adjust itself for what is the current, not only the current level of the means of production, but also the needs of the population in terms of replacement. And this would be a much more free process under socialism than capitalism. So the doom and gloom philosophy of Malthus and the twisted racialized theories of social Darwinism that combined with it are really all products of a bourgeoisie that has hit its limits and did so a long time ago. And the fact that all of these theories keep coming back in various different ways and presented as new somehow shouldn't surprise us, because it's every time the bourgeoisie starts to run into a crisis, they dust off Malthus again, they dust off Herbert Spencer again, if they're like the likes of Elon Musk perhaps, and they dust off all the neo-Malthusians of the mid-20th century and start rehashing their arguments. And this goes for all these clowns on British television, of course, the sort of fascist-inspired ecologists like that wretched old fool David Attenborough, or the woman who talks to gorillas, Jane Goodall, who goes around saying the problem's overpopulation and that we need to go down to the kind of population we had 500 years ago, which is just ridiculous given the level of productive forces that we have available for us, and of course the fact that through constant innovation we can now create more efficient methods for meeting the needs of the human population without destroying all of nature. And indeed it's systems like the Chinese are running, which are innovating ways of actually conserving more of the natural world. So all of these arguments are junk. They represent just the ravings of a dead-end class that are trying to desperately find ways to explain why their system is constantly running into the ground. And so therefore the proletariat should have nothing to do with these arguments. There is limitless potential in human beings, and there is a massive untapped potential within us and the productive forces that the capitalist period has brought into being, which it is unable to use. And so we should reject out of hand all of this Malthusian nonsense and social Darwinist nonsense for the garbage that it is, which is, again, the ravings of a dying class, which is prone to bouts of melancholy and wild reactionary romanticism. So let's pause now for questions and comments from the forum. Hello to Peter, who's joining us from Perfidious Albion. He'll be catching up in the morning. Muzzle Paint says Soylent Green. Soylent Green is people, so said Charlton Heston. Rob says, my dad is from the correct side of the Pennines, but he is full of confused and often reactionary ideas. Well, welcome to Perfidious Albion. Comrade Hello Hi says, the right can't blame capitalism, so they look for anything to try to push their ideas. Well, yeah, Ben Shapiro ties himself in an ideological knot 3 times a day, trying to avoid blaming capitalism for the problems he decries. On Any Sundry Mule says, I would have thought that Russell Brand is flicking enlightenment switches in a good way in the minds of 5 million heads. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. It's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. It's no good flicking a light on in a darkened room if you immediately smash the light bulb with a hammer, called Alex Jones. Hello to Klavik. Brand is a huckster and a charlatan, and yes, he is indeed, and always has been. Fake hippie bullshit is no answer at all. Ash says, the curbing of the bourgeois revolution is why there are still vestiges of the old order. Many communists in India mistake that for thinking these societies are semi-feudal instead of capitalist. Very good point. The vestiges are there to be used as a tool against the proletarian revolution. And indeed, the Indian ruling class learned that from us. So, yeah, great stuff. On Any Sundry Mule says, the institution of the Norman caste system, class system, came about via the shooting of the English King Harold in the eye with an arrow at Hastings. From thence all landowning aristos are derived. There were landowning aristos before the Normans. I know it's a popular thing to say amongst English radical circles that aristocracy arrived with the Norman invasion. No, it didn't. There was an aristocracy before the Normans. The Normans, what they did was, they, of course, unified the English nation together, finally put an end to the various different disputing kingdoms, and instituted a more, shall we say, more ruthless form of government. So in that sense, they took the more chaotic feudal oppression of the pre-1066 period and turned it into a more thoroughgoing and efficient oppression of the peasantry. So yes, if you were a peasant, your life probably got harder in some respects. But bear in mind, prior to 1066 and prior to the Norman invasions, there were all kinds of miseries and oppression inflicted on the peasantry by Viking raiders, marauding bands of different aristocrats, etc. I know that there's this big thing about the Norman yoke in English mythology, but it is fundamentally just a myth fed by Anglo-Saxon mythology and also the novels of people like Walter Scott. And yes, a lot of the aristocracy derived themselves from the Norman period, and the Normans wiped out a lot of the old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, but fundamentally this was a battle between two different forms of aristocratic invaders. The Saxons, of course, being an earlier form of settler coming over from, of course, Saxony. And a lot of the mythology about that period comes from the writings of the losing side of that war. So yes, the English ruling class are a bunch of scumbags, but the people who became immediately before them weren't much better. And harking back to a mythological time when there was more supposed freedom in England doesn't really do us any favours, I don't think. David Green says, Richard Hofstadter was a liberal historian, but his early book on American social Darwinism opened me up in the 60s to these ideological relationships. Very interesting point. Now, I've not read that book, though I have heard of Hofstadter. Yes, the way in which Malthusianism and social Darwinism combine together in a bourgeois thought, it is constant. And again, it reflects, as I said, as the argument has gone, the limitations of the bourgeois revolution and the immediate fear of the bourgeoisie of the proletariat. And we get another comment here from Comrade Hello Hi. As I was saying, the right are backed by capitalism, but workers reject their rhetoric, which led to an increase in the anti-fascist movement in the 2010s. Yeah, it did. I mean, I've been to a lot of anti-fascist demonstrations in the 2010s. I mean, I'm not sure whether you're from the United States or from Britain, so I'm only going to comment on the British side of things. But in the British side of things, yes, there was a lot more supposed anti-fascism in the 2010s. A lot of it, though, wasn't very good. And I've commented on this before. A lot of it was a fraud. I knew a lot of people involved in Unite Against Fascism 14 years ago now. And what that was, certainly was an organization run by the trade union bureaucracy and subcontracted to some Trotskyites in the form of the Socialist Workers' Party. And they had a founding statement that was signed by David Cameron, and the majority of their activities revolved around going around telling people in these areas that had voted for that fucking clown Nick Griffin, or what was the other guy's name, Andrew Bronze, who got elected to the European Parliament, telling everybody who put them in office in that fucking white elephant of a parliament to vote Labour next time, or to vote for whoever would get the fascist out. Now, appealing on the surface of it, of course, but think about what they were doing there. And I am purely talking about UAF here, so if you're referring to something else, then do let me know. The problem with that is, though, that what you're telling the working class to do is to reject the bad man Nick Griffin, a fascist clown, of course, but then you're telling them to vote for the Labour Party, UAF were, and you're telling them to vote for the Labour Party that carried out the Iraq War, that's carried out constant and near constant acts of brutal imperialism over many, many decades, and which has proven itself to be a lifelong enemy to the working class. So a lot of these supposed anti-fascists were telling people to vote for a political party, or they were even telling people at one stage to vote anybody but the BNP, vote for the Tories other than the BNP. Okay, well, these are imperialist parties that have committed unpardonable crimes against the working class domestically, and even greater crimes against colonized peoples all over the world. They've done things that the likes of, Griffin the Clown, or that fucking moron Tommy Robinson, that's real name Stephen Yaxley Lennon, that Robinson's his stage name, that they could never do in a million years. These supposed anti-fascists of 10 years ago were running around telling people to vote Labour. Vote for the party with a massive death toll behind its name in the name of anti-fascism. That doesn't work. That's not an argument that I am prepared to go along with. I don't believe that by keeping a couple of fascist clowns out of the European Parliament, by voting for parties of brutish imperialism, that represents anything particularly positive. No, we don't want the BNP or the EDL running around. These are organisations which are fundamentally of the bourgeoisie. So for the Trots and the others to run around screaming, vote for this bourgeois party over another bourgeois party, because the bourgeois party headed by Nick Griffin is aesthetically more obnoxious than the bourgeois party headed by Tony Blair or Gordon Brown or Ed Miliband. That's nonsense. That's not anti-fascism. That's trying to get the working class to go along with a faction of a political faction of the bourgeoisie. And it's a waste of time. Yeah, it's a waste of time. You don't fight fascism with other factions of the bourgeoisie, which is what the mainstream, the biggest and most prominent and well-funded supposed anti-fascist institutions, mainly Unite Against Fascism and Hope Not Hate, have been doing in this country for many, many years. And there's a reason why they're the biggest and the best funded, is because they try to push workers into voting for the bourgeois parties again. Now, bear in mind that the bourgeoisie's got you coming and going. Where does the EDL's funding come from? It comes from the bourgeoisie. Where does the BNP's funding come from? It doesn't come from the knuckle draggers that they bring out to their demonstrations. It comes from the bourgeoisie. It comes from groups of pro-fascist bourgeois who are sometimes more prominent, sometimes less prominent. So the enemy shouldn't be regarded as one particular group of fascists. The enemy has always and has got to be the ruling class themselves. Whether they wear the garb of the Labour Party, or whether they hide behind the Labour Party, or they're more openly fascistic and they come out and back the BNP. So the way in which you have to conduct yourself, in my view, is not trying to get the working class to choose between equally abysmal and reactionary trends, political trends representing different sections of the bourgeois. The way is to, of course, unify the working class against the bourgeois. What official anti-fascism in Britain seeks to do is that it seeks to separate fascism from capitalism. It seeks to separate fascism from imperialism. Because if you're going to do a serious analysis of what British fascism actually constitutes, it's the most extreme anti-worker end of the bourgeoisie, who at the moment, or more to the point, back then, about 14 years ago, didn't have a great deal of power. They were quite small. There's a great deal more of them now. And so what it does is it blinds workers as to where fascism comes from. What we have to do is to be telling people the truth, which is that fascism is now and always has come from the ruling class. Yes, it makes a mass base for itself in Italy and Germany amongst the ruined petty bourgeois, and it always seeks to make a mass base for itself amongst the ruined petty bourgeois and lumpenized elements of the working class. But its origin is in the ruling class itself. And that's what, and if you really want to combat fascism, which I think everybody here, other than perhaps our fascist frenemy last night, wants to do, then the target has to be the ruling class itself. And pointing out why the ruling class will revert to fascism when it is under a particular amount of pressure. This is how you build an anti-fascist consensus within the working class, by pointing out that this is a product of the class enemy. I mean, fascism has always been, since its invention, since Mussolini came up with it, representing a sort of parody of socialism. And you can tell this in the way that it organized itself, the way that they sort of parodied the mass membership organization of the communist parties of the time, the way that they ripped off shamelessly things like the mass sporting clubs that the communist parties ran, because they were looking to tap into the things about communism that were appealing to people and present a sort of distorted version of it, present a fake revolution to the discontented petty bourgeois and the lumpenized elements. In the form of course, the Nazis, this was much more developed, and this took the form of their anti Jewish prejudice, which is that the fake revolution that Hitler presented to his followers, one that was, of course, very safe for the bourgeois, took the form of official anti-Semitism, which, of course, escalated as the crisis of German imperialism escalated throughout the 1930s, and is reaching a crescendo, of course, which would ultimately lead to the horrifying acts of mass murder in the Holocaust. But this is all needs to be considered when you're asking the question of how do you effectively conduct anti-fascist struggle. And the answer is not going down the route that the American left has gone down or the British left has gone down, which is in saying that, well, to be anti-fascist, you've got to vote for Joe Biden, the guy who's doing the genocide right now. Or to be anti-fascist, you have to vote for Keir Starmer, a man who's endorsing a genocide right now. So this is the things that we need to be aware of. We need to be aware of the leftist frauds who will tell you that, voting for Genocide Joe is the anti-fascist option. You have to be honest and straight with the working class about what fascism is and where it comes from, and it is merely the most extreme manifestation of bourgeois rule, but it has a great deal in common with all the other forms of bourgeois rule, including bourgeois democracy. I hope that addressed your point to a degree, but I will address the point that you raised there, which is, what you say is correct in that a lot of workers are just going to immediately turn their backs on sort of so-called right-wing populists. I mean, there are workers in the United States that are, of course, attracted to the Trump phenomenon, but I would say that the phenomena of Trump and others like him in Europe is much more based on the lower end capitalist class and the petty bourgeoisie than it is the working class. I think, and Americans correct me if I'm wrong, the voting trends in the United States still show that the biggest single voting group in the United States in terms of the working class are those that don't vote at all. It's not that Trump inspired a mass working class rebellion. He got some and significant working class support, but he inspired principally a movement of the petty bourgeois and lower capitalist class, which is the basis for so-called right-wing populism, I think, both in the United States and in Europe. Right, okay. We got more people coming in here. Frank says, please say a few more sentences about David Attenborough. David Attenborough is one of the greatest frauds on British television, and that says a lot. He's now held up as this sort of beloved figure, this sort of charming old grandfather, whereas in actual fact he's a TV presenter first and foremost, and he's a member of the sort of lower end English bourgeois, and he represents all of the ideological trends I've just spent the last hour talking about, which is and also his documentaries routinely fake footage, by the way, they to play into a narrative, which of course these documentaries are largely works of fiction. They're cut to tell a story. They're cut to not illuminate the wonders of nature, but to play to a certain agenda. I mean, I watched an interview with a fairly right-wing guy, like an old liberal, Patrick Moore, the founder of Greenpeace. Interesting guy. I've read his books. Very, as with all these older liberals who've been kind of left behind, he's very confused about modern capitalism and all kinds of anti-communist inclinations. But he made a good point about Attenborough. He said, Attenborough routinely lies and cuts his footage to tell us stories. Attenborough a few years ago said, these walruses are jumping over a cliff and committing suicide because of climate change. And Patrick Moore made a good point. No, the walruses were running over the edge of a cliff because they were being chased by polar bears. He actually looked at the footage, and it was the walruses were being chased by polar bears and had jumped off a cliff and into the water to get away from the predator. So, and Attenborough cut that to say, they're committing suicide, in this tear-jerking voice. Because, of course, his documentaries aren't there to tell the truth. They're there to tell you a story. And sometimes they have very nice pictures in them. But the problem with them is that they're presented as fact to a population that, because, most people don't have the time to learn about the natural world, they're presented with all this stuff and as if it's fact, and take it as fact, and don't understand actually what's going on because they're not shown it. Attenborough tells stories, and like all bourgeois storytellers that get onto into the bourgeois press, he tells stories to convey a message that the bourgeoisie wants to get over. He's a propagandist. Simple as that. Right. Can I say a few words on doing class-conscious work in the labour movement? Tony says. I can say that it's very difficult. If you've not checked it out already, go and check out the stuff that I do with several other comrades in the Class Consciousness Project. There's some very interesting stuff on there that you may find illuminating. But I would say two things very quickly here in response to Tony's question. The first thing to say is that the most power you will ever have in the official labour movement is not as an official, certainly not as a full-time official, and certainly not as somebody elected to high office. The most power you will ever have is at branch level when you are interacting directly with workers. As soon as you go above that and you start to hold positions regionally or nationally, and you start to lose touch more and more with workers, and also because you're elected to these regional and national positions largely as part of somebody's platform or somebody's slate of candidates, you're obliged then to carry out the decisions of these bodies and also justify the decisions that they've made. And what you find is that this separates you. This separates you from the workforce that you were originally supposed to represent. And you end up towing the line of the union and the group that runs the union, even if it doesn't make any fucking sense or the union's completely owned by the employers. And so I would say that the thing to bear in mind is that we should be sticking to developing links with the workers at the grassroots level. We should also bear in mind that as soon as they were invented, of course, trade unions became, they exposed their limitations, which is that these are largely defensive organizations, which are created by workers to respond to the day-to-day attacks of the capitalist class in the workplace. They are not tools for working class liberation. And so, therefore, when we're active within them, we should, of course, be supporting any move by the workers to improve their material conditions. That is what any communist should do. But again, we should be aware that all wins, even if it takes us forward slightly, are temporary. The ruling class will always look for ways to subvert or destroy whatever gain that you have made. And workers need to be aware of this. We do not need to be selling them the lie that you can, of course, make continual improvements via the struggle of trade unionism. There will be temporary improvements at best. And now, given the extreme crisis of modern capitalism, temporary improvements will be few and far between. So what trade unionism represents is the ability to talk to workers and help to develop their class consciousness through struggle to the point where they are at least reaching, to use Marx's distinction, the position where they are a class for themselves, a class for itself, rather than a class in itself. And that means that they've reached the sort of trade union level of understanding. We then, though, need to be pointing the working class towards communist parties and towards the Communist Party, because, of course, the Communist Party represents the point at which the worker can start to become a revolutionary, because the Communist Party can carry out the work of raising the level of consciousness beyond the trade union level to the level of being an authentic proletarian revolutionary. And so, to reiterate my point, trade union work is still necessary, but it is limited. There is no such thing as a great bureaucratic savior, as the likes of Sean Fain in the United States and Sharon Graham here have proved. The best position to be in is at the shop floor level, where you are still in touch day to day with the working class. Don't try and get positions on national or regional committees, because you'll end up just being a servant of the union bureaucracy rather than the working class that you are supposedly elected to serve. And of course, when engaging in struggles, try to point workers towards, of course, the line of and the stance of the Communist Party. Right. Let's move on to the next question. I hope that Tony got something out of that. The so-called AWL, Alliance Workers' Liberty, got banned from the Labour Party. Yeah, they've been banned before, but somehow they always get back in. I think that they just get banned periodically to make them look edgy, but they always seem to be in there. Funny that. Yes, comrade, who says there are genuine anti-fascists. Of course they are. Of course there are. But there's a lot of trade union bureaucrats who have turned anti-fascism into as I said, into just a vote Labour operation, which isn't what it should be. Comrade Hello Hi asks a question. Do you support the World Anti-Imperialist Platform, and has it built a relationship between the parties? I do support the World Anti-Imperialist Platform, and it has, as last time I checked, a growing list of parties which have started working in coordination with each other through the platform. There's a lot more details as to the different supporters of the platform on the website, so go and check that out if you want more info on that. Okay, well, Tony, I'm glad you liked the response, and read through the articles in the Class Consciousness Project there, and also the CPGBML site too, where, of course, you'll find a lot more similar methods of analysis. I'm just going to drop that particular link into the discussion as well, so you can see that. Always stuff to be learnt there. Right, okay, this is getting on towards the midnight hour in Britain, so I am going to start to draw this to a close. So hello to Pablo Popova, by the way, who says, hello, comrade, thank you for appearing on Rebirth of Communism yesterday, a very interesting talk. Well, yes, be sure to go and watch that if you haven't already. Very interesting discussion I had with Comrade Michael yesterday. Areas of agreement and disagreement, which made it a very interesting conversation. And again, I'm going to invite Michael to appear on the program next week or the week after. So, thank you to everybody who's tuned in. A special thank you to everybody who asked questions. I hope you've enjoyed this tour through Malthusian madness. And I'll be back with you again at the same time tomorrow.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kick them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.